Hello, everyone. Welcome to FiredUp, the podcast for marketers working in early and late-stage startups. I'm Morgan McClintock, the CEO of startup marketing agency FireBrand. We've launched this podcast to interview the best in the business, but I'm not going to do it alone, so please meet my co-hosts.
I'm Nicole Pytel, FireBrand's VP of Content Marketing.
And I'm Chris Ulbrich, FireBrand's Head of Media Relations.
I'm Ian Lipner, a tech PR and crisis communications veteran.
We'll drop a new episode each week, so there's plenty of fuel for your marketing fire. Get the spark you need to take your startup to a whole new level.
Hello, and welcome to a special edition of Fired Up. I'm your host, Chris Ulbrich, filling in for our regular host, Morgan McClintock, and I'm here with my colleague, Ian Lipner.
Hey, Chris, how's it going?
Going great. Great to have you on. So today we're going to be talking about crisis communications, what it is, when you need it, why you need it, how to know if you need it. So Ian, you're the member of our team with by far the most on the ground, in the trenches experience with crisis communications. You actually worked at a crisis communications firm before coming to FireBrand. How did you wind up there after starting out in more product-oriented PR?
I guess in a word, cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is kind of the bridge in my career between the tech that I was focusing on from a product perspective prior and what the shape of crisis increasingly looks like for a lot of companies. Back when I first started doing PR for cybersecurity companies, cyber risk was seen as sort of something for either the largest companies, the companies that had financial transactions or public infrastructure attached to them. And it wasn't seen as something that could kind of affect, all the types of companies. And so I got involved in a few projects in a cyber crisis because basically it was sort of a hard thing to explain to the general public about what was going on. And my experience in working for endpoint security companies, forensic security companies, that came in handy as a couple technology crises were hitting with a company that I was working with as a contractor. So I soon found that a lot of my tech experience was to come in handy on other related crises that are sort of more modern versions of old kind of crises, reputational crises related to technology and how it's used. I did some work in the programmatic ad industry and some other areas where risk and technology intersected.
Now that raises a really important point. We should probably just start with some definitions here. The types of PR really operate on a spectrum. It's not like there's a clear distinction between what you might think of as traditional PR and crisis PR. When I've worked around crisis specialists, they always struck me as the kind of like the fighter pilot of the industry, or maybe you might say the sub commanders of the industry, very level-headed and called in to take the toughest assignments. But what exactly is crisis comms at its heart, and how does it differ from other kinds of PR?
Crisis communications, the main objective is to mitigate damage to reputation during and immediately after an incident. It's a shorter term practice and relationship between most of the professionals who specialize in it and the brands that they support. It's less marketing than it is risk management. And so even the interfaces are different. Less likely to work with anyone in marketing, more likely to work with folks in, for example, in the legal department, general counsel, as well as the C-suite. So when a crisis happens, your message control is limited, right? So you're not able to craft the narratives that we do in regular so-called PR, product PR. You're not able to maintain a long-term view of brand, it's not the imperative at the time, right? Now, the best are able to achieve that as well, but they become secondary goals. In crisis communications, the situation is unpredictable. It requires real-time adjustments to messaging, and the story evolves quickly and can be influenced by external factors. So trying to own that narrative it's difficult and maybe not a good idea a lot of the time. And then I would say with regular PR, you're targeting a broader audience, including the general public. Whereas with crisis communications, you're really trying to focus in on the stakeholders that are most affected by the crisis and in order of the damage to the business. It's a much more stark and black and white set of decisions that are made because that's how the public will ultimately view it, and because that's how the court of law will ultimately view the way that you communicate.
It's interesting you talk about a court of law, and that raises the important point that a classic form of crisis is one that involves some kind of legal threat to the company. So it's not necessarily just a reputational damage, but it could be legal liability, other forms of financial loss. I think we are all familiar with classic examples of PR crisis where you have tainted food or a serious executive malfeasance at a public company. And that's the picture we have in our minds of what a crisis looks like. But I imagine that it's not always clear cut when you're in a crisis. So especially if you're at a company that's not in the public eye, the way that the biggest of the big are. So if you're a startup, how do you know it's time to switch into crisis mode?
You have to kind of look at, first there's the obvious, right? The disasters, major legal matters, total disruption of services and operations, right? Those are the crises where, the public may already know by the time you're deciding whether it's a crisis, right? Then there's sort of the test of, are your customers, your clients, your investors, meaning the closest stakeholder audience, are they communicating a loss of trust? It's a key part of it because we managed a lot of sort of incidents that I don't know if they rose to the level of crisis, right? And we would be clear with our client or a new client or our prospect, however you want to look at, somebody responding to it and asking the crisis agency what they think. Sometimes it's just a social media kerfuffle, right? And it just looks bad to all the brand people. But customers aren't commenting and nobody cares from a financial perspective, right? There's nothing more than bad press, right? About something that customers, clients, and investors aren't asking more questions about, right? Those are not necessarily crises. But I'd say in the vast majority of situations, the comms department, the marketing department, does not know that there's a crisis department until it's well underway. It's someone in the C-suite or general counsel that calls in the crisis specialist most often. And often marketing is the last to know. Right.
And in my experience, especially at smaller organizations, the crisis response is initially and sometimes entirely handled by attorneys, often by the company's general counsel. It sounds like the more enlightened counsels will, understand that at some point it makes sense to bring in a crisis consultant who can bring a different perspective to the problem. So how, in your experience, do lawyers approach a crisis differently from crisis specialists? And, how do those two approaches potentially complement one another?
Foremost, attorneys are focusing on minimizing legal risk. They're looking at providing advice to their client that is helping maintain the best interests of the business foremost. And that usually means communicating less. Communicators, the crisis communicators, are trying to protect the reputation of the company, which is usually under duress at that moment because partly of the inability to share a lot of information. So the job of the crisis communicator, who is often contracted by the attorney in order to maintain client attorney privilege as much as that is possible, the job is to provide a way to communicate that does not negatively impact legal risk, but helps those key stakeholders, whether that's employees, whether that's customers, investors, it helps them feel better about not getting very much information at first, right? And make sure that they're not getting information that will later be determined to be incorrect.
Right. To recap, you're in a crisis, broadly speaking, when you find yourself in an unexpected situation where your business's reputation is at risk. So the job of a crisis manager is to, first and foremost, limit the damage to reputation, whereas traditional PR is usually trying to buff your reputation day to day. The best versions of crisis management will, through some jujitsu, manage to improve your company's reputation on the other side of it. But that's the best case scenario. At baseline, you're trying to limit damage to the reputation. So that's what we're dealing with here. What are the, if any, sort of core principles, the do no harms of crisis communications? Are there some just sort of best practices, core principles that most crisis managers will be able to refer to as starting points and then build out a response from there?
Yes, I think best practice is really important with crisis communications. Tempers are hot. Mm-hmm. People are worried, and they make defensive decisions, or some folks try to go the other way and be creative. First of all, during a crisis, you need to involve as few people as possible. You need to involve only those people who operationally absolutely need to know. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Too many cooks. There's also potential leaks. So sharing internally is not a great idea until you really know what you're dealing with. The second thing is keep the focus on the true stakeholders. I referenced this a little bit earlier. Your employees, your customers, your clients, your investors. Those are the people that matter first. They're not the only folks that matter, but Joe Public is not involved in a lot of crises that might find him interesting. The third thing is you need to communicate uniformly. And that might sound relatively simple, but it gets back to that first point about involving as few people as possible. And it involves training those people in advance so that they understand that their ideas should not be injected along the way. They should not be improvising or freelancing when they're communicating. I guess the fourth thing I would say is you don't communicate anything that isn't certain, and being very disciplined about the word certain, because facts change. Your best idea of what's going on in a situation can be wrong, and your reputation will be held to account, regardless of why you got the bad information.
I imagine in most crises, the first step is just to figure out what's going on. From my own experience, I have observed how much even spokespeople don't know about every last aspect of a business, especially if there is some kind of allegation coming out of left field. You don't know if it's true. You don't know if other people are aware and you're still getting up to speed. So how, as a communicator, do you let stakeholders know you're on the case and reassure them you're on the case while rushing to figure out what's really going on?
You got right at a big part of the job, right? And notice that it doesn't really involve media yet, hopefully. One of the big things that you're doing as a crisis communicator, and you might have a crisis communications plan in hand to help you with this part. We can talk about that too. The number one thing you're trying to do is to earn time to identify the root cause and to get a sense of the probable timeline for the resolution. That's two things at once. You need time to figure out what's going on, and you need time to figure out how long it's going to take. Right? In the meantime, those stakeholders are asking, what's going on? How long is it going to take? Over and over again. And so you need to create and craft responses that don't sound like someone's hitting the same button over and over again, but that ultimately communicate exactly that. A lot of that language you'll see is quite portable from one crisis to the other, right? And that usually involves something to the effect of, we understand your concern and we appreciate your patience as we seek more information about this. And that is not satisfying to a range of stakeholders depending on what the crisis is. So you will have what we would call escalation methods or escalation language for those folks for whom that first layer of language that I just talked about is insufficient. You'll have ways to make sure that the person that we're escalating is among those key stakeholders, right? So those kinds of trestles are what you set up so that you can, I meant scaffolds, so that you can do your work, right? Which comes next, which is explaining what is going on as you find out the things that are certain. And then later, in the best organizations, explaining in a fulsome way what happened.
In your experience, when you do find out what's happened, let's just say that what happened did not reflect well on the company. Inevitably, there will be voices within the organization pushing to hush things up. And then there will be other voices pushing for disclosure. How do you sort of navigate that or sort of negotiate between the two to figure out how the best way forward?
Yeah, there's a lot of voices that come in, and that's even before you get to the point where you think you know what's happened and you know how it can be resolved, right? I have seen more than one C-level executive say, well, that's not in our culture to not be completely transparent. So we want to communicate everything that we know right now. Well, in that situation, we were able to explain the legal risks if they didn't have the correct information. And it turned out later that they hadn't had it. So that first level being, what is legally required, right, to disclose? What is legally risky to disclose? And then the next level is, once you have figured out, what those things are, is how do you disclose that and communicate it in a way that conveys the transparency that you're trying to deliver versus looking like excuse making or otherwise, not delivering the intended effect.
Right. If I'm understanding you, it sounds like you're saying that the goal is transparency as far as legally possible and advisable. And, you have to balance these competing needs in a crisis. But overall, especially as a communicator, you're probably going to be biased towards openness and transparency where possible. Can you sort of talk about the reputational implications of secrecy versus transparency. Because again, as communicators, I think I know where our biases are, but it feels to me like that's a benefit of bringing in a crisis consultant, that they might understand the value of transparency.
Yeah. When I started in, I absolutely had a very strong bias toward transparency through that process. But I saw what happens when you're narrating an actively changing situation and how that can really undermine trust. We think it's this. Now we think it's that. Oh, those people don't know what it is, right? And even if you're trying to convey technical information, I mean, I've seen this in the midst of cyber breaches, right? There's all sorts of requirements intended to protect the public and protect privacy to disclose breaches. And the difficulty about being specific when there's a known problem is that those fact patterns change. The criminals are clever. They put the wrong breadcrumbs down on purpose. They act as if everything's fine so that they can do more harm, right? Meaning it might look like your systems are back up and running, but they're still in there. And so the transparency can look a lot more like inviting someone into the restroom. And, it's not something that helps the situation in a lot of cases, right? Now, once you're into the true postmortem phase, then what we usually see is that those organizations that have experienced these crises, which aren't, especially in cyber, aren't necessarily as a result of their negligence, right? These can be zero-day attacks. These can be very complex social engineering attacks, right? It can be multiple points of failure versus some, lack of investment or things like that. And things can be accidents, right? In those cases, the organizations that have come through and been able to figure out what's going on, they're eager to share information about why it happened to help other companies avoid those same issues, avoid the vulnerabilities, avoid the supply chain mistakes, avoid those environmental, and I don't mean specifically our environment, to avoid those impacts of normal of the course of doing business in the world today, right? As I worked in crisis, I saw why timing transparency is important.
What I'm hearing is you do want to be transparent, but you don't necessarily want to be communicating every twist and turn, every hypothesis that might be under discussion behind the scenes. You want to communicate in a way that inspires trust, and the best way to do that is to understand the facts, communicate the facts, and then once you have done that, what about the action plan for making things better? Presumably, once you've communicated what's happened, in some ways the most important thing is to follow that up with the action you're taking.
That's right. It's the operational changes that you can report on and discuss. There are ways to do that in different kinds of forums, depending on the nature of your crisis. I'll keep leaning on cybersecurity because there are so many ways that organizations can share their experiences after a breach with other organizations. There are, in addition to the larger industry-wide councils, there are councils specific to the CISOs and the CIOs of each industry. And there were cases in which that was exactly what we did, is showed the technical behind the scenes and played it back for folks in the same industries like financial services or education or insurance, and shared them with the other folks who were there to stop those kinds of crises. The thing that we see most often is a a rededication to the preparation for the next crisis, right? Once organizations have been through a small crisis, they can see what the possibilities are across more of their business. It's definitely the case that, and I don't mean to say what a small crisis is and what a large crisis is, but let's say a ransomware incident that knocked a company offline before they were able to restore from their backups and knocked them offline for a week, right? That kind of crisis might lead a company to do a full review of all of their areas of risk and ways to prepare so that they don't find themselves scrambling, which most companies do. They find themselves scrambling at the moment of crisis for the proper counsel. That includes the attorneys that I referenced prior if they don't have a crisis communications plan, as well as their communications partners. Most companies do have business continuity plans within their IT departments. So it's not like they don't understand the need for preparedness. I think often they don't understand or aren't alive yet to the need for a communications plan that rides alongside all of those business continuity plans on the IT side.
Yeah, and I want to talk about that in a bit. But before we do, what does it look like when you're getting the crisis response wrong? Not you, but when an organization is fumbling their crisis response, what does that tend to involve?
It goes on for longer. More people hear about it. Sometimes people accidentally break the law. Competitors capitalize on it. It impacts revenue, maybe even, because of downtime. Executives take personal reputational hits. Some people even lose their jobs. I mean, that's probably the order of how it goes. And of course, there are those existential crises that can end the company.
Right. Okay. So the stakes are high. And in the face of that, it's probably no surprise that there will always be, as I had referred earlier, voices in a crisis that say, if we just don't say anything about this, it'll just go away. Like, let's not feed the beast here. Let's just keep our heads down, don't comment, and let the storm pass over us. What do you think about that approach?
It can be true with the media, but it depends on the crisis. It depends on if human safety is involved, you can forget about that. But while it can be true with the media, it often doesn't work well with people paying you money, right? Or people losing money because of you, right? And the real value of the crisis communications professional is securing the relationships with those key stakeholders. It's not making sure that the media narrate it properly, right? It's very difficult to achieve that in the short term. And there have been many cases where we have told our clients that you should continue to say nothing, even as the incorrect version of events was being reported. Back to that original point, we didn't know for sure what the truth was going to be yet.
So that's a really interesting observation. It can be better to say nothing than to say the wrong thing. So again, even given that overall bias towards, openness and transparency, it sounds like giving out the wrong information is so damaging that you would rather say nothing at all.
Yes, in many cases, that is true. I think what you can control, it's very difficult to control the message. I'm not saying that there aren't those magicians who can do all of it at once, but you can control the clock a little bit, right? You can decide when is the right time to release information, right? And you've heard about, Friday evening releases of news and so on and so forth, but it's true, right? Not everything is a business to consumer crisis.
Mm-hmm.
And a B2B crisis tends to wait over the weekend for folks who aren't going to log on to that system yet anyway, right? Closer you get to real-time revenue generation, the less likely you are to have stakeholders who are patient.
Right. That was a point that I did want to address, that crisis for a startup, while it's going to share some, it could share, many similarities with a crisis for, a gigantic packaged goods company. The fact that the startup tends to be less visible to the public in the first place means it has less inherent media interest, which, to your point, might give you some more time. It's not as inherently newsworthy that there's trouble brewing at a company most people haven't heard of. So that does potentially give you some time to get your story straight. And it sounds like you're saying that for a startup, while you need to be on top of it, it's important not to lose your head. And I wonder, to what extent does the value of a crisis specialist for a startup, to what extent is part of that value just keeping everybody calm and keeping things in perspective?
Yeah, that's right. A good crisis communications manager has a cool head foremost. And when you're experiencing these things along with the client, you can easily, especially if you're somebody who is an empathetic person, you can easily start to absorb that sense of anxiety from the client, right? And then you become less effective. So those with the cool head do the best. And somebody put it to me once, and they told me that they got it from an ambulance driver. It's not your emergency. It's the company's emergency, right? So you can't be the one that's in trauma. There also has to be a good knowledge of what best practice is and an ability to defend it, to be assertive enough to say, no, here is what you should do. C-level executives and general counsel want clear and directional advice, not an array of options. They already know what their options are. So it takes a certain ability to say, this is the best advice. This is the best practice. And then you also have to have a next play mentality. Clients will go against best practice, right? Your CEO will do what they want to do anyway, right? And you have to immediately be adaptable and be ready to provide the best advice for the next phase. So if the CEO decides, I want to go out there and I want to make a speech, and they go out and they make a speech and now everyone is more worried, you're going to need to be able to assert yourself again, provide a new strategy or an updated strategy, and move on to the next play.
That makes a lot of sense. In the interest of not running around losing your heads in a crisis, you mentioned that it's good to have a plan. How do you plan for an event that by its nature is unexpected and will come at you from in some way that you hadn't necessarily anticipated? What goes into a crisis plan, and what are the most useful elements for a startup?
It's a great question. I think the first thing is that roles matter more than scenarios, right? And hammering out what we would call the Crisis Communications Response Team, the CCRT, deciding who will be in the know, making that team as small as is functionally valid, right? You need to have input from folks who have oversight of all the different stakeholder groups. And it isn't always necessarily the same exact group. You can have auxiliary members, right? IT-oriented tasks versus some sort of problem in the parking lot, right? But you hammer out that team and how that team is activated. Talking about contact information, talking about alternative means of contacting should systems be down, so on and so forth. That's the first level. And then what we would always do is we would create a scenario spectrum of sorts, right? We would take a look at the most common scenarios for companies of that type, right? Organizations of that type, right? And we would talk over with the executives the likelihood of a problem in that area, as well as the potential impact of a problem in that area. And you could literally plot that on a graph if you would, right? And it helps you decide which scenarios are you going to build out initial responses for most. So there's probably, I've seen as many as 20 scenarios built out. Most startups aren't going to need that, right? That's multinational corporations that have regulatory and site requirements and so on and so forth. But having the bones of that plan in place and having a few scenarios built out, as well as a sort of other scenario, gets you the language that you need to create that scaffolding I was talking about, to buy yourself the time to figure out what's happening, right? The language that you might expect that I said is pretty portable across incidents. Now, that's not enough because you're going to need to communicate the next step and the next step and the next step after that. But at least you can call up your team, your CCRT, which includes your outside counsels, and get that going. And there's something to provide the incoming press should that be required in that scenario.
Right. I'm sure it is a source of comfort in the middle of a crisis, and it probably helps the process get started on the right foot to be able, once you realize you're in a crisis, to just be able to break out the crisis binder, so to speak, and start following the plan that was laid out ahead of time. And, even though I said earlier that a crisis by definition comes at you from an unexpected angle, you make a good point that there are certain scenarios that will invariably crop up for any business if it exists for a certain period of time. And there are certain types of business, like if you offer a consumer service, if you take consumers' financial information, it's almost a certainty at some point that there will be a breach. And so it sounds like, based on the kind of business you're in and the fact that you're in business at all, you can anticipate needing plans for a certain number of scenarios, even if you can't possibly cover every possible eventuality.
Absolutely. And to get back to how I got into crisis, it's because of cyber. Cyber is going to happen. A cyber incident is going to happen. And the number of startup companies for whom data is a key portion of what they're either offering or collecting or leveraging, it's amazing to me how many don't have a fulsome cyber communications plan. And then when you take a step back from there, the world is a regularly uniform place when it comes to certain risks, right? Like there's going to be something that happens in the parking lot at the odd company, right? There is going to be a problem with one of the sites and the environments that one of your employees is in, right? Someone's going to hurt themselves, right? Like it's part of doing business, unfortunately, is that accidents happen, and to ride along without any safety belt is much worse than to get in a fender bender with your seatbelt on. And that's how the public feels about it too.
All right. Well, I think that's a great note to end on. Crises will happen. Keep your head, have a plan. Ian, it's been wonderful having you on. I've learned a lot, and I hope to see you soon.
Thanks, Chris. I hope it's not during a crisis.
Me too. All right. You take care. And thanks to all of you for listening. We'll see you back next time on Fired Up.
Well, that about wraps it up for today. But before we close, we did want to offer all of our Fired Up friends a chance to grab a mega pack of all of our ebooks and guides. That's our guide to content marketing. That's our startup guide to paid media using Google Ads. It's our guide to attribution. You can get all of those, over 100 pages of goodness, at firebrand.marketing/fired up freebies. That's freebies with an S. And we hope you enjoyed the show. And if you did, please give us a rating wherever you get your podcasts, or drop us a note at firebrand.marketing. And as ever, the details of how to get in touch with our guest today can be found in the show notes. Thank you for listening. And until next week, get out there and crush your marketing goals.